Hello everyone. In this video we are going to introduce ourselves to the idea of natural law theory, which is a very important branch of moral philosophy in general. It represents sort of one of the major traditions in both ancient but also modern moral philosophy. And we are specifically going to be learning about natural law theory in the context of this guy, St. Thomas Aquinas, who was really instrumental in integrating a kind of natural law theory into religious thought, specifically Christian or Catholic theology. So, just a little bit of background here. Thomas Aquinas is pretty clearly the most influential Catholic philosopher in history. He is working in the context of the 13th century, living from 1225 to 1274. So we're moving along through quite a lot of history here. And the sort of branch of philosophy that has come to be known in his name is the branch of Thomism. So if you are a Thomist or a Thomist, you subscribe at least to some pretty essential aspects of Aquinas' philosophy. And for many centuries after Augustine sort of faded into the background, Aquinas' views would become sort of official Catholic doctrine. So his natural law theory is of enormous political and world historic influence. However much we might disagree with it or agree with it, it's certainly part of our culture in the West. And the other thing to bear in mind is that Aquinas was in many ways trying to integrate Aristotle's virtue ethics into Christian theology. So a good way of reading him is to think of him as an Aristotelian who nevertheless subscribed to a Christian God rather than the polytheism of Aristotle's time, but was very much taken with the notion in Aristotle and the Nicomachean ethics of developing a virtuous character through the soul. There are going to be differences between Aquinas and Aristotle, to be sure, but very often in Aquinas' work, he will simply refer to Aristotle as the philosopher. In other words, the most important philosopher in history for Aquinas was Aristotle, and he sees himself as building on the Aristotelian tradition of virtue ethics. Okay. Biographically, Aquinas is an Italian, born in Sicily, born into a wealth. He becomes a Dominican at a young age and studies classics very intensively. He's a very brilliant student, receives his master's degree in 1256. He eventually makes it to Paris, where his focus on Aristotle it becomes quite immersive, and it's during this period that he begins to forge his own sort of philosophical innovations and his attempt to conjoin his Dominicanism with Aristotelian virtue ethics. By all accounts, he experiences a kind of mystical conversion experience in 1272, which really sediments his faith in the Christian God, and he writes about it very, very eloquently throughout the Summa Theologica. And it's here that really he sees it as the task of philosophy and moral philosophy to sort of synthesize Christian doctrine with natural law. He is eventually canonized as a saint in 1323. There are a lot of complex political reasons surrounding that canonization, but it is very clear that by this period of history, Aquinas' thought is absolutely mainstream, central Catholic theology. Okay. Now, I think the first question that is motivating his big book, the Summa Theologica, is the origin of morality. Where does morality originate? This is an important question, which Aristotle kind of talked about in his own way, because Aristotle began with a teleological account of human action, which sort of argued that there's sort of an inborn goal-directedness of human existence, and to sort of figure out what the highest goal of life is to make certain decisions about what kind of life to live. And ultimately, we discovered that for Aristotle, the happiest kind of life is the happy life, which turned out to be a life lived in accordance with virtue. Now, Aquinas certainly is much taken with that Aristotelian conception of teleology, but he is also totally mired and born through this tradition in religious thought known as divine command theory. Divine command theory is sort of the most simple and mainstream way of thinking about the origins or the genesis of morality and good and evil, and it's sort of a theory of how human beings who are not themselves godlike and not themselves perfect can come to understand God's will and put it into practice. And divine command theory has a very simple premise, and the premise is actions are good if they follow the command of God or they follow the will of God. And alternatively, actions are evil if they disobey the will of God. So for those of you who have any religious background, whether it's Christian, Jewish, Muslim, probably you are familiar with at least some kind of divine command thinking, in that sometimes it's often the case that really we just equate right action with the will of God, and we equate wrong action with disobedience or failure to enact that will of God. Now, Aquinas is quick to point out that divine command theory has a big problem right at the center of it in terms of maybe the missing information that we might want to come to an understanding of what it is that God really wants from us, right? Divine command theory seems to assume that we really do have a perfect window onto the mind of God or the will of God, and therefore there shouldn't be any controversy over what right action is. Well, if we look at human behavior and we look at the world around us, we see that actually there are all kinds of different interpretations about what that divine command might be. That's why there are very many different elaborate religions, each of which have their own sort of specific codes of conduct, right? And so divine command theory leaves us a little bit in the dark in terms of how it is we are to have perfect knowledge of God's command. Okay, so we have that problem of knowledge or that problem of ignorance, but then there's an even more sort of fundamental problem that occurs as early as Plato's writing on the Euthyphro, and certainly it finds itself in other areas of Greek thought, but Aquinas really takes it up in the Summa Theologica, which is this problem: is an action good because God commands it, or does God command an action because it is good, right? In other words, if I say I subscribe to divine command theory and I tell you, well, I know an action is good if God commands it, that doesn't seem to actually explain anything about why God commands one action rather than another, right? It doesn't give us much of an account of why a particular course of action is morally good and morally sanctioned or prohibited, right? So we seem to be caught in this issue of causality, right? Divine command theory seems to just be pointing at one of the properties of an action that God has commanded, rather than giving sort of a causal explanation of why God commands a particular action rather than another, right? So Aquinas is deeply dissatisfied with the divine command theory tradition as the basis for grounding not only belief in God, but also our moral compass, our orientation for ethical life. So Aquinas proposes an alternative to divine command theory, which is natural law theory. And the great benefit of natural law theory for him is that it actually does not require belief in God. Now, of course, Aquinas will very much prescribe to others and, certainly commit himself to a belief in a Christian God, but he believes that as the creation of God, human beings should not have had to have any specific religious education to understand what God's will is. In other words, human beings have an inborn or innate understanding of right and wrong, and it's natural law theory that's going to articulate that innate understanding rather than divine command theory, which sort of assumes expert knowledge or at least the right kind of education within a specific religious tradition. Okay, so all rational humans have the same moral law written in them. This is a deeply nativist or innatist kind of theory of morality. It certainly has kind of an echo in Aristotle, if you remember, because Aristotle, while he didn't believe all human beings are naturally good per se, did seem to sketch out a theory of human character, which was deeply bound up with the idea of having a rational soul, right? And Aquinas very much agrees with Aristotle that we do have a rational soul that can come to a pretty universal understanding of good and evil. Okay, so we have to sort of articulate a couple of different types of law here that is sort of always operating in Aquinas' thought. The first is what he would call God's law or eternal law. Eternal law is essentially God's divine plan. This is kind of the divine command theory story, right? It's the idea that God has created the cosmos, the whole world, and is sort of actively intervening in a providential sense in our behavior. And so eternal law is this order of morality that transcends the human being. It is this godlike and really true metaphysical conception of morality, right? Now, Aquinas very much believes in eternal law and thinks that we all should too, but he doesn't think it is enough to simply, for a moral theory, to simply say, look, I believe in eternal law and so should you. He wants to articulate a moral theory that is the product of that eternal law, but is not necessarily contingent upon my knowledge of God's law. All right, and so that position will be this second position, which is the natural law. Natural law is understood to be the rational human's participation in eternal law. So the degree to which we as human beings, we as finite, imperfect creatures, right, and the products of God's plan, can participate in the eternal law, but without ever fully knowing it. We never have a perfect representation or idea of God's eternal law because we are finite beings, right? And God is an infinite being. Nevertheless, as the creatures of God, as the product of God's plan, our rational understanding of right and wrong is very much the result of eternal law. It is a byproduct of eternal law. So it is this kind of human and interworldly understanding of what reason is and what a virtuous soul should do. And then we have conventional law. The order of convention is really just the literal rules and laws that any given community writes in a political and social way. So human-made rules may or may not conform in any meaningful way to eternal law, let alone natural law. Some laws that we write are total violations of eternal law. When we read Martin Luther King Jr. later on in the course, you will see that he very much subscribes to a conception of natural law, which holds that slavery and segregation are indeed conventional laws, at least for a certain portion of human history, of American history, but that they are violations of eternal law as well as natural law. So think of the rules of conduct that we write together as a community as being imperfect imitations of natural law, and natural law is kind of this mediating middle ground between eternal law and conventional law. So we have a sort of a hierarchy of law, as it were. Okay, so natural law is confusing then because it is this mediating connection between eternal law and conventional law. It is neither fully divine nor is it merely convention. And the key principle behind it that you should understand is that it is inherently normative. A normative claim is any claim that is making an assertion about the value of certain rules of conduct or action. All right. So unlike an empirical claim, which is a description of things as they actually exist, natural law is both grounded in reality, but is pointing to the value of that reality. And you'll remember from Aristotle the notion of teleology. In teleology, Aquinas is trying to bring into synthesis with natural law to the effect that natural law is kind of a way of understanding the human being as having purposes, having having a natural place in the world, and having a certain orientation towards certain states of affairs. If you remember from Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, he differentiated two types of action. Some actions we undertake for the sake of some other telos or some other goal, and some actions are just goods in and of themselves. And the main action for Aristotle that turned out to be a good in and of itself was happiness, or eudaimonia, or flourishing. And Aquinas very much agrees with this teleological understanding that human beings, and really all living beings, are goal-oriented. They are designed to be creatures that have it as their natural purpose, a certain position and a certain outcome or a certain end. So natural law is the process in which we come to an understanding of what is our natural purpose and what our naturally right orientation to the world is. So Aquinas is at great pains to point out the natural inclinations that all living things have throughout the Summa Theologica. And a natural inclination is something that is pulling us in the direction of a particular course of action because God has created it, right? So natural law is like, if you think about the law of gravity, which is a physical law, it demands or it dictates that objects fall according to a certain velocity. And really, the whole of human behavior abides by certain inclinations that God has programmed into us. And Aquinas believes that the human soul can come to an understanding of what those inclinations are so that we can adjust our life and live according to those inclinations. Inclinations only exist as means to the ends of natural law. Okay. So what is the good? If we're arguing that the human being is a creature of God and we all have sort of a inborn understanding, or at least the capacity to understand natural law, what are the inclinations that are particularly good for Aquinas? Okay, one principle is that the good is that which all things seek. In other words, goodness is a kind of teleological program. We are all oriented towards a certain result or a certain consequence. So that which is good is a directedness. It's a goal kind of structure or logic. The second principle is that the good is to be done and promoted, and evil is to be avoided. So in other words, Aquinas is arguing that we really do have access to God's understanding of the good. And we do have the capacity, because it is built in our inclinations, to realize the potentials for goodness and to avoid the potentials for evil, which are also available to us as well. There's nothing preordained or programmed about the human being actually putting into practice natural law. All right. So I just kind of urge you to look at page 125, where he sort of specifies these principles in a great amount of detail. And reading Aquinas, of course, can be very difficult because he's dealing with a very scholastic language, written originally in Latin, translated for us in English, but very jargon heavy, very much filled with all kinds of arguments and rebuttals and so on. But nevertheless, you should try to parse out the text. Okay. So Now Aquinas is going to try to just enumerate, is just going to list what the greatest goods are. And they're all natural inclinations, he thinks. We all have sort of a really universal sense that this is what we're here for, and therefore this is what we should do. Okay. He is going to ground the good and the inclinations of the human in a concept of reason or rationality, which comes straight out of Aristotle, right? There are slight modifications, but if you remember, Aristotle defined virtue as activity in accordance with the soul, and the soul he understood to be part rational and part irrational. The soul can be rational to the degree that it's orderly, that it's reflective, that it's making practical judgment about our action. And the soul is disorderly or irrational to the degree to which it is sort of a slave to our passions and our appetites, right? And Aquinas does think we have this really universal power or faculty of knowing, this soul within our bodies that is the creation of God and the vehicle by which we come to an understanding of the human being. So through reason, the faculty of mind, humans can pursue their natural goods. In other words, we're not going to carry out the natural law simply because it's a question of instinct, although the natural law is deeply innate. It still requires an extra act of mental choice, of mental deliberation and mental reflection, right? So even though natural law is deeply natural and innate, it still requires a higher order kind of mental act of the understanding. All right. Now, like Aristotle, Aquinas also totally believes in free will, and he believes that the soul is a unbounded faculty. We really do have the ability to choose between alternatives in life. We have the ability to choose between good and evil, and God created this free faculty. Now, this is a huge problem throughout the history of religious thought because we get into this seeming contradiction of, well, how could a faculty like soul be free if God has sort of created it for us, and God is sort of the master orchestrator of everything in the universe, right? And other thinkers like St. Augustine in On Free Choice of the Will tried to sort out in a very kind of elaborate way how freedom of the will could coexist with God's providence. Aquinas and other Catholic thinkers kind of argue that, well, even though God is deeply involved in our lives, and we are merely the creations of God's plan, we nevertheless exist within a very finite and limited horizon of natural law, in which, because we don't have perfect access and perfect knowledge of God's plan for us, we can only make choices for ourselves on the basis of that limited knowledge. So our actions are unbounded; they're not pre-programmed in any sense. We still have to choose amongst alternatives. Human freedom is the foundation of the moral being. In other words, it would make no sense to think of humanity as having any moral value or content at all if we weren't free, right? If we were just truly executing the divine law according to a script of sorts, we would have no moral character at all. We couldn't be blamed and we couldn't be praised for our actions, right? So it's totally foundational for Catholic and Christian thought to understand the human as both finite and the product of God, of a God who is providential and yet at the same time free and responsible, and therefore blameworthy, perhaps, right, for failing to enact natural law. Free will navigates the inclinations, and to the degree to which we pick the right inclinations, we are good, and the degree to which we avoid those inclinations or succumb to the temptation of evil inclinations, we are blameworthy. Now I want to just kind of list the basic goods that Aquinas really sees as being sort of the backbone, the skeleton of natural law theory. And these are goods that are both sort of really programmed into the human animal, and yet at the same time require the soul, require reflection and cognition. The first is life, and by life, Aquinas simply means the virtue of self-preservation, right? Natural law theory, from Aquinas throughout its modern versions, it will be deeply rooted in the idea that one of the purposes of human existence is to preserve the self, right? You have kind of a right to defend yourself, and you have a right to stay alive and to thrive, right? Like everything else in nature, that's a deeply programmed natural impulse, right? Or natural inclination. And it's a good thing. There's a virtue to prolonging life or staying alive and thriving, right? So like all living things in the world, the human being is programmed for self-preservation. This is an innate good. The second is reproduction. We have a natural inclination to procreate, right? And we have, kind of biologically been programmed to experience the reproductive act as pleasurable, right? God has programmed it such that there's just this natural inclination towards the generation of more life, right? So we not only have a right to life, we have a right to spread life, to create more life than previously existed. And then we have an inclination of rearing, of kind of like child rearing and education of the young. This is sort of a principle of extending the virtues of natural law to children, to those who belong to the community. So I tend to think of these first three natural goods as sort of bundled together in Aquinas' thought, in that they're all very much geared towards the survival and extension of the human species in general. These are all natural basic goods programmed in us. We have an innate understanding of them, and they're right in and of themselves. He then goes on to argue that one of the basic goods is to seek God. He believes that it's an innate human impulse to try to come to an understanding of God. It's not the case that we will all agree on what God is or what the specific contents of God are, but that we have a desire to know God is a basic good and a basic inclination of all human life. And indeed, if you look at all human civilizations and all human movements in history, it seems that the human being wants to understand God and creates these enormous world religions in order to do so. Sociability. Human beings have a natural sociability. In other words, we are social creatures. So this is some more of Aristotle coming in. Aquinas argues that we're inherently creatures of community. We want to share the world with each other. We're not creatures who are inclined to be isolated. Some of us might seem to be, but really the natural driver of human existence is community and interaction and shared experience, right? So that's a natural good of the human. And then we have a natural inclination to avoid offense. This is kind of the flip side of sociability. This just simply means it is a natural good not to alienate others and to push people away out of your life, right? So whenever someone is failing in their sociability, it usually comes from some kind of perversion of the natural good to avoid offense. It means something has sort of corrupted or broken their power of sociability, with the result that they're behaving in all kinds of alienating and asocial ways. And this would be seen as a kind of a degradation of the basic good. And then we have, as a basic good, the last one, to shun ignorance. In other words, human beings, like Aristotle says, are naturally inquisitive. We have a desire to know the world. We have a desire to know nature. We have a desire to know God. We have a desire to expand our civilizations in technologies and science and the products of our knowledge, right? So this is a natural orientation of the human. Okay, so these are the basic goods, each of which have much more detail throughout the book, but this is sort of the basic outline of the story, that this is what constitutes the human inclination of the human. Now, just to kind of think about natural law theory in terms of a dilemma, so we can see how this sort of works, consider this question. does natural law theory allow us to lie to another person, even if it means you're trying to save a life? In other words, can you do something a little morally wrong for a greater good? What would natural law theory say about that? Catholic Church actually is pretty straightforward about these kinds of dilemmas. And the answer would be that means are not justified by ends. In other words, a greater good does not justify a morally dubious means. Natural law does not always allow us to see divine law. The thinking here is that because we have a very limited understanding of what God believes to be the right choice, we kind of are, if we're pulling something off for a greater good, playing God a little bit too much. In other words, if we're trying to justify a particular end through means that are less than morally sound, well, we're sort of presupposing knowledge of divine command, right? We should stick within the more limited domain of natural law, which preserves the integrity and the rights and dignity of all humans. So the limits of our knowledge mean the limits of human knowledge of the divine are limits to moral action. In other words, because we don't have a perfect window onto God's will and God's understanding of goodness and evil, it means that we can't justify our actions even if we believe we are generating a greater good. Because first of all, we don't always know the complex chain of causes and effects that exist within nature. We have a very limited perspective on what the outcomes of our actions can be. And so we can only make judgments on the basis of what we do know and the intention underlying or underpinning our limited vantage point. A couple of additional principles that are pertinent to natural law. There are many more, and we'll see other thinkers kind of take up the basic principles of the theory. But one is the golden rule. Perhaps you've heard of the golden rule. The golden rule simply holds that you should do unto others as you would have done unto you, right? This has a deep tradition in Christian thought. But we will see secular, non-religious thinkers subscribe to it as well in many ways. But the idea simply being, look, we're all equals before God. We're all equals within natural law. And so no one has a right to sort of trample on the natural rights of another. You can only act in such a way that the rights to life, sociability, community, etc., that you subscribe to and want for yourself are protected in the other. Okay. And then we have this notion of the Pauline principle. And the Pauline principle is sort of a variant of the dilemma we were dealing with, but one should not do something evil for the sake of a greater good or a good end. In other words, the ends do not justify the means, right? This is a deeply held Catholic precept coming out of St. Paul, but certainly present in Aquinas' thought as well, right? An evil action is not justified even if you believe a greater good might be the product of that action, right? So, and this is just simply following, again, like I said, from our understanding that natural law positions us within a limited horizon of knowledge for the soul. Just a quote from the text here before we wrap things up. If I can get out of the way of the quote. Aquinas writes, "The natural law can be blotted out from the human heart, either by evil persuasions, just as in speculative matters errors occur in respect of necessary conclusions, or by vicious customs and corrupt habits, as among some men theft and even unnatural vices, as the apostle states, were not esteemed sinful." So all this to say that even though Aquinas has this kind of theory of natural law, which really strongly suggests that we all basically by nature understand what is good, it is still no guarantee that we can't be corrupted, right? It is still no guarantee that through free choice of the will, we still can't decide to turn away from the natural law and from our inclinations. There might be all kinds of things in our culture that corrupt our knowledge of natural law. There might be all kinds of temptations in life that seem to push us away from knowledge of natural law. And so this is just all to say that given that even though it is a natural inclination of people to be good, there's nothing safeguarding your goodness from evil, right? It still requires active participation in the ultimate good. Okay, just a few conclusions. There's a lot more to say about this material, but I just wanted to establish the main principles here. We've discussed the distinction between divine command theory and natural law theory. I just want you to understand the basic idea behind Aquinas' critique of divine command theory and why it doesn't really give us an adequate account of why we should believe in a particular course of moral action, and why it's actually a very limiting theory, even if one wants to subscribe to a particular religious faith. We have this kind of hierarchy of orders: eternal law, natural law, and conventional law. Tried to understand how it is that we are participants in eternal law, but only in a very finite and imperfect way, and that natural law is the domain that we've been thrown into that allows us to sort of mediate between eternal law and conventional law. Reason, or the soul, the activity of soul, is the power that allows us to know natural inclinations, and try to have a feel for that list of 7 basic inclinations that are programmed in the human, but which the soul can sort out for itself through reflection and practical deliberation. The natural goods of the human being include things like life, procreation, sociability, education, knowledge, and faith. These are basically universal goods that all humans participate in and are sort of written into our, I hesitate to say DNA, because Aquinas wouldn't have that sense of human nature, but written into our nature. And yet at the same time, pursuit of the goods requires an act of free will. Okay, so that is natural law theory as it has been expressed in Thomas Aquinas. We will pick up the thread of this the next time we meet in person. Thank you, everyone.